EPA's clean diesel programs. We have several listed here, all of which have a primary purpose of reducing harmful emissions by replacing older diesel vehicles with new, cleaner vehicles.
Recent grants have focused on education, outreach, and/or demonstration projects. Some of the topics included tree canopies, community gardening, reducing heat impacts, and improving energy efficiency in urban cities.
Since 2021, EPA has been implementing its PFAS strategic roadmap.
We're finally getting this thing across the finish line.
You hear that? That's the Environmental Protection Agency in action. The EPA's been working to protect human health and the environment for over 50 years. And recently, strong policy and funding have taken the agency's work to new levels, especially in climate adaptation and resilience, mitigation, emission reductions, and more. One of the offices at the EPA hard at work across these issues is the Office of Policy. The office makes and coordinates EPA policy and decision-making in cooperation with teams across the agency. From crafting to reviewing and promulgating regulations, the Office of Policy is hands-on with so many different responsibilities. There's environmental economics, adaptation, the National Environmental Policy Act. The list goes on and on. So, I wanted to take today to break down what this office does exactly and how it's doing its part to keep both us and the planet healthy. Welcome to Empathy Affect, the Forest Marsh Media podcast that explores the human side of government. I'm Melissa Harris-Szynski. We're joined today by Vicki Arroyo, EPA Office of Policy's Associate Administrator. She started with the EPA back in the 1980s and has since become a powerhouse in the environmental policy space. Both she and her family experienced firsthand the devastation of climate-related disasters, so I can think of few others who could bring lived experience and poignant expertise to share with us how the EPA is working to protect us all. Vicki, welcome to Empathy Affect. It's wonderful to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I know we are here to talk about the Office of Policy, but before we get into that, I think a great place to ground this conversation is in some of your personal connection to this field, with the experiences that you and your family have had with pollution and environmental disasters in New Orleans and Louisiana. So can you share a little bit about what you and your family experienced and witnessed and how it's shaped your career and journey at the EPA?
Sure. Well, I did grow up in New Orleans, as you mentioned, and the drinking water source, as you might know, is the Mississippi River, just downriver of large chemical and petrochemical plants. And studies back in the 70s when I was growing up were linking cancer to drinking our water. I heard about that as a very young person and had my parents take me to some public hearings on the topic before I could even drive. And I started speaking out and working on these issues and pursued education in this area at the college and graduate level and eventually law school, and started my career at EPA back in the Reagan administration working on air toxics. And now, of course, very proud and grateful to be a political appointee in the Biden-Harris EPA under Administrator Michael Regan. So I started in the Reagan era and now I'm in the Regan era at EPA. So that was kind of, my early introduction to environmental policy and science. And I, like many people nowadays, have also had some personal experiences with the impacts of climate change. And New Orleans is especially vulnerable to heat and storms and rising seas. Many of the folks in New Orleans live below sea level. And my family certainly suffered losses in recent years. My father passed away actually during an evacuation from Hurricane Ivan the year before Katrina hit. People thought that was going to be the big one. Fortunately, it did not devastate New Orleans that year. But of course, the next year, Hurricane Katrina hit. And most of my family that remained in New Orleans had lost their homes. And some even moved in with me for the better part of a year. And then more recently, of course, Hurricane Ida hit New Orleans again and affected my family members. So I've both been working on climate change for 25 years or so and had these experiences in my personal life, which of course, I think it's fair to say, builds empathy and awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry to hear about your father and about your family losing their homes. I know everyone has sort of been touched by climate change one way or another.
Absolutely.
In 2024, it's hard not to. So I'm glad that, you could at least bring those experiences to the table now in your current role, which brings us to the Office of Policy. Some may know that the Office of Policy at the EPA has a lot of responsibilities. So, you dabble in climate adaptation, ensuring NEPA compliance, permitting, et cetera. So for listeners who may not be aware, can you introduce a little bit about your office and how your work impacts their day-to-day lives?
Sure, absolutely. Our Office of Policy, as you mentioned, has a very broad portfolio. We are responsible for coordinating policy across the agency, and that often involves collaboratively working with the program offices and the regions to support the administrator, ultimately, who we all work for, in his decision making. We also interact with the White House, including the Office of Management and Budget, on rulemaking and the economic analyses that support our rulemakings, and also with the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, at the White House on NEPA, as you mentioned. On the regulatory front, we work with other EPA offices to craft and promulgate regulations to meet EPA's mission, which is to protect human health and the environment. And some of the recent final rules that we've contributed to that I'm very proud of on behalf of the agency and our team here in OP include recent vehicle standards finalized in March that are the strongest in history, reducing billions of tons of greenhouse gases and encouraging broader adoption of EVs and hybrids. In April, we announced a suite of final rules issued under separate statutory authorities to reduce pollution from fossil fuel-fired power plants, protecting communities' public health, and still providing for reliable electricity in those communities. We've also taken several actions on PFAS forever chemicals, including our first ever nationwide legally enforceable drinking water standards for PFAS that are helping to protect hundreds of millions of Americans from PFAS exposure. So we have a key role in the regulatory role of EPA. We also have a unique review authority under the Clean Air Act to review other agencies' environmental assessments under NEPA. We have an office that works with communities on community sustainability and revitalization, things like smart growth and transit, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, rural public health, or I should say economic development, local foods, local places. We've recently launched a new office on climate adaptation and sustainability as well. So, we do a lot. One analytical topic that we have worked on that's been in the news is a new metric that allows us and other agencies to account for the damages that society faces from climate change. It's called the social cost of carbon, or greenhouse gases. It's sometimes called the most important number that people haven't heard of, but it really is important, and it's going to be something that we'll use in our rulemakings and our NEPA analysis, and other agencies are following our lead as well.
Well, you certainly sound very busy, but it's all good things. And I know that you just touched upon, amid that list of wonderful activities you have going on, the Office of Climate Adaptation and Sustainability. But just backpedaling a bit, earlier this summer, the EPA released its 2024 to 2027 Climate Adaptation Plan. So there were a few different focuses there: the climate workforce, resilience, rulemaking integration, among other highlights. So I'm wondering which elements your office is most focused on and what steps you see your team making to help the EPA meet the plan's goals.
So thanks for that. As you said at the top, we're all experiencing the effects of climate change. And this past Sunday, July 21st, was the hottest day recorded on our planet. So we are taking steps to be able to make sure that EPA can meet our mission of protecting public health and the environment, even as the climate changes. I'm privileged to serve as the top adaptation official within the agency. And so my office is responsible for overseeing the drafting of those plans for the agency and the implementation of that plan. We're also, of course, working across the agency with the program offices and the regional offices. All of them have developed their own plans for their work as well. So some of the activities that are supporting that climate adaptation plan include a climate literacy initiative where we and the Office of Research and Development in EPA are making sure to increase the understanding and awareness of our staff at EPA about the implications of climate change for our mission. We're also leading the agency efforts to integrate climate adaptation considerations into the rulemaking processes, like the rules that I shared earlier, where it's appropriate, considering the statutory authority, to ensure that those rules are effective even as the climate changes. So this includes working with the agency on making our rules and financial investments more resilient to the changes that are underway. And of course, that's especially important because we have historic levels of resources, $100 billion that came to EPA from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's really going to be important to spend those in a way that is resilient to the impacts that we're seeing. We're also working in close partnership with tribes and our Office of International and Tribal Affairs to help federally recognized tribes take action to anticipate and prepare for and adapt to climate change. And then finally, we're working on setting up metrics to track the performance of our activities to make sure that we're investing taxpayer dollars in the most effective way to ensure that we're able to continue to fulfill our mission even as the climate changes.
Definitely. With the Office of Climate Adaptation and Sustainability that you mentioned earlier, that launched in March, I'm wondering what role that office plays in overseeing the commitments of the plan. I know you played a very large role in conceptualizing the office. So, how will it build on the climate adaptation work that your office has already been tasked with overseeing and in meeting some of the goals of the plan?
So we are coordinating climate adaptation and resilience, building a capacity across EPA in OP that has happened even before the creation of this new office. But I'm very pleased that we will be bringing in a senior career SES, senior executive service official, to lead a great team of people, some of whom already are here and some of whom we'll be hiring to work on both climate adaptation and sustainability under the leadership of a new senior career official. And we will certainly be working with the different offices and programs across the agency to integrate climate adaptation into programs and rulemakings and enforcement actions and other operations. We'll also be partnering with states and tribes and territories and local governments and businesses to increase resilience across the nation and to develop cross-cutting strategies for industry sectors and communities. We have a group that is called the Smart Sectors Team that had existed before the new office, but now they're going to be part of that program, and they work collaboratively with the business community to encourage and support private sector environmental action. So they'll be working on their resilience as well as opportunities to decarbonize and to improve their environmental performance. There's also some tools that are available for others, for communities across the country. I just want to lift up one in case your listeners want to check it out. It's called the Climate Adaptation Resource Center, or ARC-X, which is designed to help communities anticipate and prepare for the changes that are underway.
Vicki just gave us a taste of the Climate Adaptation and Sustainability Plan, and this plan is actually quite core to the EPA's greater fiscal year 2022 to 2026 strategic plan. You see, this strategic plan for the first time has climate change as its own specific objective, with mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction, and adaptation and resilience to climate change as their own goals. So let's take a step even further back to see how the EPA has been grounding climate action in its mission through 3 long-term performance goals in its strategic plan.
First goal is internally focused. It calls for successful implementation of the priority actions in our adaptation plan and the implementation plans of the programs in the regions. And the second goal is focused on assisting federally recognized tribes to take action to anticipate, prepare for, adapt to, and recover from the impacts of climate change. And the third goal is to assist states, territories, and local governments and communities, especially those that are underserved and disproportionately at risk from climate change, to take action to prepare. And of course, as we all know, certain communities and individuals are particularly vulnerable to impacts of climate change. And this includes low-income communities and communities of color, children, the elderly, tribal and indigenous communities that are often hit first and worst by climate change. So we want to make sure that these communities and individuals have resources to cope. Unfortunately, there are some new resources that are being made available through the bipartisan infrastructure law and specifically the Inflation Reduction Act to provide funding for communities like these to implement community resilience hubs and cooling centers, to invest in amenities like cooler roofs and surfaces and parks and green space. This can address heat, and it can also help to curb some of the flooding for some of the extreme weather events that we're seeing. And it also provides, even in times when there isn't an extreme weather event, for physical and mental health respite in terms of air pollution control and more amenities like outdoor recreational space and wildlife habitat. And it provides for social cohesion as people get out of their homes more and can interact with people in parks, tree-lined streets, things like that, that both reduce the temperatures of their communities, but are also an amenity that communities seek year-round.
I want to get back into NEPA for a little bit. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act for listeners who may not know, and it requires government agencies to assess environmental impacts prior to making decisions. So just dovetailing the conversation with climate adaptation, as our country has needed to adapt to a changing climate, can you explain how NEPA has played into climate adaptation projects across the country, and if there are any examples of projects where NEPA reviews have significantly enhanced climate resilience and adaptation?
Well, thank you. NEPA is a really important statute. It's been around since 1970. And under it, as you say, federal agencies are required to consider the environmental impacts in decision-making and conduct these assessments. And Section 309 of the Clean Air Act directs EPA, this position that I'm seated in now, the AA for Policy, has much of this responsibility per our administrator. Regional administrators have some of this as well, to review and comment on the environmental assessments that are coming in, the environmental impact statements from these other federal agencies that are associated with major federal actions that affect people in communities across the country. And so we review over 300 of these each year. And our role is to shape a project's climate resilience and adaptation features, as well as find opportunities to mitigate or reduce conventional air pollution or greenhouse gases, look at community or tribal concerns, EJ concerns, noise, or other issues that might be associated with a project. And so one of the things that we're doing is we prioritize climate and EJ in this administration is to comment along these lines when we're looking at the development, for example, of new projects at military installations. And so one example is the March Reserve Base, a military installation in California, where our regional office recommended incorporating features into the project description and design to reduce the impacts of excessive heat. So adding vegetation to the area, cool surfaces and pavements that will store less heat, which contributes to an urban heat island effect if you don't try to curb that localized heat, providing for shade trees, and the use of carbon pollution-free electricity generation consistent with our executive orders. And the Air Force is incorporating these changes that EPA had recommended. Another example that I'm really proud of, because this was led by me and my team, is our successful effort to influence the U.S. Postal Service with its procurement of its next generation delivery vehicles. Through our unique authority, we completed a NEPA review in 2022 for the Postal Service of their initial environmental impact statements. And you might recall, because this made a lot of news, that the Postal Service was initially committing to only 10% electric vehicles for the huge investment they were making in what is really the government's biggest fleet that will be around for decades. And we found that the initial analysis was really deficient. And we pointed this out in our formal comments, including assuming very low and stable gas prices and not accounting for the reduction in prices over time of EVs and their batteries and the very low maintenance and operating costs of EVs. And as an EV owner myself, I can attest to that. Plus, it's great not to have to pull into the gas station. So the Postal Service prepared a supplemental EIS and worked with us to secure some improvements and identify other alternatives. And where they ended up is much improved with an increased battery electric vehicle commitment of 62%, up from the original 10%. And earlier this year, in January, they unveiled the first set of EV charging stations at their Atlanta sorting and delivery center.
And as you can see, those are not gas pumps that are hooked up to those vehicles. They're electric charging stations.
That was USPS Postmaster General Louis DeJoy at the unveiling of the Atlanta EV fleet.
These are the first deliveries of the 66,000 electric vehicles that we will be deploying across the nation over the next 5 years. At this location, all 237 carriers will eventually be using electric vehicles to deliver on their routes.
And that's right. The USPS has said that it anticipates adding at least 66,000 EVs by 2028, making it one of the largest EV fleets in the nation. Just think about that commitment and the role that NEPA and the EPA are playing to help our country make important steps to reduce emissions. Now, USPS was able to make this investment with the help of $3 billion from Inflation Reduction Act funds. Known as one of the largest climate investments in American history, I couldn't help but ask Vicki how this landmark legislation is also impacting the EPA.
It's really a game changer. When I first came back to EPA after many years, I was disheartened to find that the agency had about the same staff levels that we had in the Ronald Reagan era, and yet we were fighting these big challenges that are today challenges like climate change, environmental justice, and PFAS, right? With like very limited staff resources. And our budget on an inflation-adjusted basis was roughly the same as well. So the infusion of support from historic investments like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and more recently the Inflation Reduction Act have really changed EPA's mission from just being a regulatory agency, but it also provides for us to be a funding agency and to make these investments in communities that need it most and to really drive changes even faster and at lower cost because we're both offering the carrot of the money as well as the stick of the regulations. And so, as our administrator likes to say, we're not your father's EPA or your mother's. And we received approximately $100 billion with a B, as Administrator Regan likes to point out, to direct to communities, I should say, to support projects that can provide all kinds of benefits, including climate resilience, as well as reducing the emissions that cause climate change and stimulating economic investment at the same time. In fact, more than $115 billion in manufacturing investments have been announced to build the clean energy economy since President Biden took office. And so there are several IRA and Bill, as I like to call them, like your uncle's programs that are helping to catalyze investments in certain areas. One is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is providing $27 billion to help state and local governments develop strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants and deliver the benefits of greenhouse gas and air pollution reducing projects to America by mobilizing financing and private capital. And we've recently announced grant selections for $20 billion of those GGRF dollars under the National Clean Investment Fund and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. And then on Earth Day, you might have seen that President Biden himself was at the announcement of our Solar for All competition winners with grants of $7 billion to states, territories, tribes, municipalities, and nonprofits to expand the number of low-income and disadvantaged communities that are primed for solar investment. And this is enabling millions of low-income households to access affordable and resilient and clean solar power. So that's been super exciting. There's another set of grant programs that are run out of the air program here at EPA called the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. And that program and the administrator just had a very exciting announcement earlier this week of the recipients for over $4.3 billion in IRA funding through the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants program to implement solutions that those states and communities came to us with and said, this is what would work in my community or my state. And we want to do these investments in a way that will help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, reduce air pollution, advance environmental and climate justice, tackle climate change, and help to accelerate the clean energy transition in a way that fits with our state or community. So the 25 selected applications will fund projects in 30 states, including a tribe, and they target greenhouse gas pollution from all the relevant sectors. So transportation was very big in people's applications because that is one of the more polluting sectors. We've traditionally had a harder time reducing emissions from that sector. The power sector, the electricity sector, the commercial and residential building sector, industry, agriculture, waste, and materials management. And the first phase of that climate pollution reduction grant program provided for an even broader set of states and communities to develop their own climate action plans. And so that's been the single largest effort to really spur the development bottom up of plans that the communities in the states really want to see to really change their communities and to have them on track for more of a clean energy future. So another set of grants that will very soon be something that is in the public domain, it will be announced very shortly by the administrator and John Podesta, is $2 billion in IRA funds that are providing for environmental and climate justice activities to benefit disadvantaged communities. And so the first round of grants that are coming through that program, the Environmental and Climate Justice Community Change Grant Program, will be announced shortly. So these are just some of the examples under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. But we're also trying to infuse climate resilience considerations in some of our earlier programs as well, programs that provide for clean water and drinking water investments by states and localities, making sure that those projects consider things like energy efficiency and climate resilience as well.
Yeah, this is such an amazing time for the EPA. Just seeing how you were comparing things to the Reagan era and now, how does this feel like deep within your heart, given that you've spent so much of your career dedicated to this?
It's really hard to express how proud I am of this EPA. I love this agency. I started my career here in 1987. We just had a going away party for a person that I worked with back then who's been at the agency for 41 years, whereas people like me have maybe come and gone and come back again. But it's that kind of agency. People just feel so much loyalty to its mission. The administrator himself started out as an intern and worked for several years at EPA, and obviously the state agency in his home state of North Carolina, as I did in my home state. But to be here at this time when we have an administration that is leading in on climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and also environmental justice just means so much. And then on top of that, to not just have that kind of support in terms of executive orders and the White House, but also to have the funding from these statutes that's really allowing us to deliver these benefits in communities has just been really amazing.
Absolutely. Just a moment ago, amid the many strides you shared you're making with the support of the administration and the IRA, you hit on the upcoming Environmental and Climate Justice Community Change Grant Program award announcements. It's very exciting, so I think it would be a great moment to talk about your involvement with environmental justice initiatives at the EPA. What was it like working with the Environmental Justice Office, and how have you found yourself integrating your EJ experiences with the Office of Policy now?
Thanks. I was really lucky when I first came in to lead that office because the Office of Environmental Justice was part of our very broad portfolio in the Office of Policy. So for the first 18 months, that was part of our portfolio too. And again, it was really wonderful to be in the agency at a time where the president, the vice president, the administrator all wanted to really lean in on this issue. And I was lucky enough to accompany Administrator Regan on the first leg of his Journey to Justice tour across parts of the U.S. that have long been forgotten. And he started in places like Mississippi with the water issues and the crises around Jackson, but also Cancer Alley, as it's called in Louisiana, that chemical corridor that I referred to earlier. And that trip and others that he has taken throughout the last 3 years has really led to real action on the ground, including enforcement, investments, regulations that have helped to deal with some of those problems, which has really been amazing to see. Some of those communities with the large chemical plants now have regulations that we've been able to put on the books this year that are reducing their exposure to carcinogens by 96%. So that's something that we can all be so proud of. When I first came in, we were, of course, really excited to get the funds from the American Rescue Plan. And we were investing at the time $100 million, which was unprecedented and huge at the time before we were talking about billions. And there we were spending money for the first time in many of these communities on air monitoring to make sure that we could even assess what chemicals these people were being exposed to. And then investing in community needs that really help them to be safer from climate impacts as well as toxics. Since then, the federal government has spent a total of $50 billion in dedicated investments to improve infrastructure resilience and safeguard infrastructure and protect these vulnerable communities. And as of September of 2022, the administrator announced the creation of a new office. So they pulled the smaller EJ office out of the Office of Policy. They combined it with the Office of Civil Rights, and they formed a new standalone national program office for environmental justice and national civil rights, which has been really great. And they've allowed that team to expand. And of course, again, the investments from IRA are allowing them to hire up and to also get money into those communities. But of course, the Office of Policy still is infusing environmental justice considerations in our work. We do that in a variety of ways, including with our regulatory role and our economic analysis role, making sure that the various parts of the agency are really considering environmental justice impacts in the regulations that we promulgate, where allowed by law, and the economic analysis that we're doing. And so just a couple of examples of that. In March, we finalized amendments to the risk management program rule, and this protects the communities that are right around those chemical plants with high accident rates by considering things like climate risk and the environmental justice risk associated with that. In April, we finalized rules that deal with these air toxic emissions around these chemical plants. And as I mentioned, we've been able to, through these rulemakings, dramatically reduce the number of people that would be expected to have a cancer risk from these exposures by 96%, including some of those communities that I visited with the administrator back in 2021. We're also in our policy office revising our technical guidance for assessing environmental justice in the regulatory analysis. So this is providing the current state of science, new peer-reviewed agency guidance, and direction to the rest of the agency on incorporating these considerations. And then even those climate change and community change grants that I mentioned earlier that the EJ office is now responsible for, we've got folks on our staff that are supporting those efforts, providing technical assistance to some of those groups that are applying for those grants on the ground in partnership with them to help them build more equitable climate resilience.
Yeah, it's great to see that bigger picture view about how EJ is getting integrated across more of the different areas of EPA. So we're close to wrapping up here. And while you're sharing so much that can give us a lot of hope, we're deep in the summer, we're facing record high temperatures, as you were mentioning, and we're feeling the impact of climate change now. So for many, it could be hard to stay optimistic or to feel like we're making a difference. So what advice or encouragement do you want to give individuals who want to continue to help their communities adapt and remain resilient to climate change?
It really is a struggle, right? Because we all read the headlines and we all have our lived experiences now with these climate impacts. And it is a depressing time in that regard. But I would say, not to sugarcoat it, that there are some solutions that we can invest in that bring win-wins to our community. So things like improving parks and streetscapes to include forest canopy and trees and vegetation, and provide shade and cool services, to also provide for microgrids in community centers that people might gather anyway, but could provide a source of backup power and safety and water and a charging infrastructure for your iPhone if you lose power. Many people who die after storms like Ida, as we saw in Louisiana and other parts of the country that it affected, didn't die from the storm itself, but from the aftermath, the heat and the lack of power. We saw this recently in Houston with Beryl as well. Mm-hmm. So there are some community centers that are being built that function all year round and have all kinds of opportunities to do job training and other assistance to the community members, but it can serve as a safe harbor for people during times of a crisis, people without air conditioning, for example. So I feel like that is something that each person who's listening can maybe take steps to ask their local officials, can volunteer for their local forestry commission, as I volunteered my husband, John, to serve on ours in Arlington, Virginia, and be part of the solution locally, and maybe invest in things that benefit your community with or without climate change.
That's wonderful. And, just turn it to you. What keeps you motivated to keep pushing through this work? You clearly have so much that you've been able to do during your time at the EPA, but it can be tough. So what keeps you chugging along day by day?
So when I started working on climate change, we were looking at what was projected future risks at the time. And I remember being struck by that as a relatively young person, but already an environmental professional, seeing what the projected impacts were going to be when I was old enough to have children of my own, which I didn't at the time. And now, of course, we're seeing in our lifetimes, in our career span, these projections not only coming true, but often seeing a reality that might be worse than anticipated, certainly in terms of the pace of warming and the changes that we're seeing, some anticipated and some that are not. And so while that is sobering, I think what motivates me is an obligation to our children and to future generations and to other life on this planet, not just human life, so that we can do the best we can at avoiding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And we can, as I said earlier, invest in ways that provide multiple benefits to communities where people live and they work and they play and they pray beyond the climate benefits. And I think that other advantage of that I've seen in my own work, in my teaching of younger people who then have themselves come into this field, is that it gives people a sense of purpose, that you're making a meaningful contribution. And so it can be an antidote to the anxiety and the climate depression that people feel, because you really have tangible results that are making a difference in the community, and that's your work that's informing that. So I am just super fortunate to live and work at a time and in a place that allows me to work on these issues that I care about, that have affected my own family and my community so directly, and so many other people as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Vicki. This has been such a pleasure chatting with you and learning about your work at the EPA and about some of the ways that we could stay hopeful and do our own part in addressing climate change and remaining resilient and making our future a better one.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
As we wrap up today, I want to leave us with a bonus small call to action from Vicki from a TED Talk she gave in 2012.
It's up to us to look at our homes and our communities, our vulnerabilities and our exposures to risk, and to find ways to not just survive, but to thrive. And it's up to us to plan and to prepare and to call on our government leaders and require them to do the same, even while they address the underlying causes of climate change. There are no quick fixes. There are no one-size-fits-all solutions. We're all learning by doing. But the operative word is doing. Thank you.
While this was over a decade ago, I hope you still hear the same care and intention that Vicki has carried with her throughout her career. And I hope you can find the motivation, avenues, and support from our government and beyond to do the same. Thank you for joining me today on Empathy Affect. If you liked today's episode, make sure to subscribe, follow, and share the show with a friend. Don't forget to rate us on your podcast platform of choice, and I hope you'll join us next time. Thanks, y'all.
Empathy Effect is a product of Forrest Marsh. You can reach us at forrestmarshmedia@forrestmarsh.com with any feedback, questions, or inquiries. If you want to know more about today's guest, are interested in participating with Forrest Marsh, or becoming part of our community, check out our show notes for more information.